Please turn in it to Luke chapter 4. This is where we'll be spending our time. In this chapter, in this reading we're going to have today, we find Jesus in Nazareth. He's at the synagogue, right where we left him last week, his hometown. And in being in his hometown, there's a certain perception that people have of people from their own hometown. And that perception is not always complimentary. Jesus is going to encounter that perception here on this day. And the people were astonished all over Galilee when Jesus first started his ministry. They were just astonished at the things he was saying and doing. They thought, where does this guy get all this? This is Joseph's boy. And yet when he comes to his hometown, their astonishment turns into a different reaction. So we'd like to take a look at that today. I'll begin reading in verse 16. Jesus went to Nazareth where he was brought up. And on the Sabbath day he entered the synagogue, which was his custom. That's interesting to me. Isn't that interesting? It was his habit. It was just his custom to be in the synagogue on the Sabbath. He stood up to read, and a scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. And he found the place where it's written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to preach the good news of the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled the scroll up and he sat down and handed the scroll back to the attendant. And everyone in the synagogue was looking at Jesus. And he said to them by saying, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And all spoke well of Jesus and were amazed at the gracious words that came out of his mouth. And they said, "Isn't this Joseph's boy?" Jesus said to them, "Surely you'll quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. Do here in your hometown what you did in the other regions, in Capernaum." Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you there were many widows in Elijah's time in Israel, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was no rain, and there was a severe famine in the land. But Elijah was not sent to any of the widows in Israel, but to the widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. There were many in Israel with leprosy at the time of Elisha, yet not one of them in Israel was cleaned, only Naaman the Syrian." All of the people were furious when they heard this. They got up and drove Jesus out of town and took him to the brow of a hill on which the city was built in order to throw him over the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. So Jesus does the thing that any person in the synagogue is going to do who's going to hold forth. He gets up, he stands, he reads from the scroll of the Tanakh, which is the collection of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets and the sayings. He reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and then he hands the scroll to the attendant and he sits down. And when he sits down, that's telling the crowd, now is coming the sermon. That's the signification of that. You know, that's where we get our term, the professorial chair. Did you know that? Stephen Hawking had the chair, the Lucasian chair in Oxford that Sir Isaac Newton occupied in the 18th century. And that word there, that meaning of the chair of the professor, comes from this text, comes from this idea of Judaism, wherein the person who's going to teach sits down to signify teaching is fixing to take place. Well, he teaches, and as soon as he does, the crowd's astonishment, this is Joseph's boy, listen to all this stuff that's coming from him, turns into raw anger. They're furious. Why are they furious? Because he did the unthinkable in the Sabbath, on the Sabbath, in the synagogue. He said, you know, God visited the earth through Elijah the prophet. But when Elijah came to do his work during the famine, wherein that widow had that oil, the little jar of oil and the little jar of grain, and she was going to, in the famine, bake just enough out of that to feed herself and her son, and then they were just going to wait for death. That's what they were going to do. It was a famine. They had no more. That was it. And Elijah came. They were not Jews. That's why the crowd is so upset here. God came and visited the Gentiles, the widow at Zarephath. There were widows all over Israel who were starving just like this one. But Elijah wasn't sent to any of them. Then he says, and remember Naaman. Everybody in the crowd would have known these stories from the Tanakh, from the Old Testament. They would have known them. They'd heard them since they were children. You know, Naaman had leprosy. There were lots of people in Israel with leprosy. But Elisha wasn't sent to any of the Jews with leprosy. He was sent to Naaman, the Syrian, the enemy of the Jews. The Assyrians, if you go back and read the story of Hezekiah, Hezekiah's whole time as king was within a siege that the Assyrians brought to Jerusalem and to Judea. Trying to starve them out. And yet, God comes to Naaman, the Syrian, and heals him. So he's taken, it's like he goes into this crowd. We talk about, in our culture, we talk about toe-stepping sermons, where a sermon steps on my toes. Well, this was much more than that. This was you're just taking a knitting needle and sticking somebody with it and then turning it a little bit, because this for the Jewish mind was unthinkable, that God would show favor to the Goyim, the Gentiles, in favor over the favor he would show to us. That's part of the problem here. The other problem is you've got, the only way to put it is Semitic temperament. The people who are Semites, and that includes the Jews, the Arabs, all of those people in that region of the world. I don't know if you've ever noticed it or not, but they get mad really fast. They just do. I mean, it's like Italians. The Italians are very closely aligned to them in terms of phenotype and genotype. And you know, we talk about the Italians as being very passionate. Well, passion goes both ways. It goes toward nice things, it goes toward bad things. The Semitic temperament, they do not ever forget history, ever. It's like Golda Meir said. She was asked one time, when are you and us going to stop fighting, the Jews and the Arabs? She said, as soon as we love our grandchildren more than we hate each other, then we'll stop. There's a passion there in this group of people that we don't connect with. I don't. I mean, I'm not as calm as Rick, but I'm pretty calm. You know, I'm not quite that calm. I wish I were. But Jesus' hearers are now, they're totally suspicious of him. They don't want to listen to any more of this. They've heard about all these nice things that Jesus has done in the region of Galilee, and they're saying, hey, why don't you do some of these fantastic things so that we can see it too? And Jesus didn't do any miracles there that we know of. Jesus is fulfilling the prophecy that was given over him when he was a baby. Remember Simeon the prophet? What did he say? He said, this child is destined to cause the rising and the falling of many in Israel, and he'll be a sign that will be spoken against so that hearts will be revealed. Wow. This is exactly what's happening here. Jesus speaks to this Jewish crowd and their hearts are revealed. What is their heart? If you don't tell us what we like to hear, we're going to take you out and throw you over the edge of this cliff. Wow. And this area, I spoke of it last week, this area is not some little hayseed backwater place. This is the Galilee is the place where the intelligentsia of the Jews are. These are the smart people, the sophisticated people. Nazareth was 15,000 people plus. It's not some little place. And these people are educated, so when they hear Jesus say these things, they recognize fully that they've been slapped in the face by it. And they've been exposed. Their anger exposes them. It says who they really are. There's an arrogance here. And I don't want to... Ed, you know this. I love the Jewish people. Don't mishear me. But all of us have something in us that distances us from God. All of us. And the Jews are no exception. What is their distance from God at the time of Jesus? They think themselves to be privileged. They don't see being called of God as the oracle to the world, the people who are going to show the world who God is. They don't see that as a responsibility. They see it as a privilege now. And so the Goyim, the Gentiles, are, as they say of them, fuel for the fires of hell. But we're the chosen. And Jesus stands right up in front of them and says, you're wrong. You're wrong. I will never forget. I've probably told you this story before. Terry and I went to play at a bank gathering. It was they had rented the golf course. Any of you know who the golf course room is out there, out toward Blackshear? They have a big hall there that they rent for events. And this bank, once a year, would bring Terry and myself in to play music for them at this banquet that they had every year. They give out all kind of presents and awards and stuff and say stuff. And they just wanted us to be noisy wallpaper for the period of time that we were there. And so we were playing music, and we came to the point at which we just arrived and we were setting up, and a woman was there whom we knew, and prominent person, and we knew her well, and she was a believer so far as we knew. I mean, a person who followed Jesus. And we saw her walk over to the person that was in charge of the room, and the person who was in charge of the room looked at her and she said, "Where's my piano?" And the person said, "I don't know anything about a piano." Well, she said, "Aren't you the one in charge of setting up this room?" He said, "Yes." The man said, "Yes." She said, "Well, I ordered a piano on Wednesday. Where's my piano? This is Saturday. Where's my piano?" He says, "I don't know anything about a piano." He said, "I'm very, very busy right now. Could I come back and talk to you in just a minute about your piano? We'll see to it that you get one, but I don't know anything about it right now." She said, "No, I want the piano now. I ordered it Wednesday. Where's my piano?" He said, "Ma'am, I've got 20 employees here. I'm very busy. I can't talk to you about your piano just this minute, but I'll be back. Give me 5 minutes and I'll come back." She was furious. I have never seen somebody's face go from Caucasian cream to red so fast and so bright. Her ears were bright. She walked over to Terry and me and she said, "I'll not be spoken to in that way." I thought, my gosh. I mean, it struck me that as a believer, I mean, Jesus said the Son of Man doesn't even have a place to lay his head. How is it that any of us are privileged because we're followers of Jesus that somebody can't speak to us any way they like? Right? That's the mentality that the Jews had. Jesus, you can't talk to us this way. You've no right to speak to us this way. They are exhibiting the same reaction that this woman had. And I think about it in terms of what Jesus talked about. He talked about things they all knew, but he was confronting them with probably the parts of Scripture that they would read like we read some of the parts of ours, where we just kind of read past them real fast because we don't like what they say. Right? Take up your cross and follow me. I mean, that's a hard passage for me to read. I read past that one pretty fast when I come to that one. And they probably did too. And they're reacting to it because they're being confronted with who they really are. There's a confrontation taking place here. Any good thing that we do as followers of Jesus is merely God being reflected in us. That's all. That's all. It's not because we're so nice. It's not because we're privileged. It's not because we're just great people. It's because God has done something in us that enables us then to do those things in a consistent way. It was the same with the Jews at this time in history. I mean, think about the widow at Zarephath. What would it be like? This is how we see ourselves, and I am convinced this is why we struggle in our relationship with God. The widow at Zarephath, all right? Elijah comes to her. They're starving. She's got that little jar of oil, little jar of flour. She's going to bake the bread and then just wait for death. That's her whole mindset. And Elijah comes and says, "Bake a cake for me." And she does it. Now, what would it have meant to that moment if she'd had a barrel of oil and a barrel of flour? She said, "Sure, I'll bake you a cake. No problem. We've got plenty." But you see, God had brought her to a place where all she had was all she had. And then God requested it of her. And she did it. And they weathered the famine. The oil never ran out. The flour never ran out. Now, I don't know exactly what all of that means, except one thing I am sure of. It says something about our lives in terms of the fact that we are so self-sufficient in our culture that we don't really need God to do stuff for us. Right? Got money, got refrigerators, got air conditioners, got vehicles, got clothing. Refrigerators are just stacked full of food all the time. I mean, mine is. Since I've been a child, there's only been once in my life where there wasn't enough to eat, and it was my fault. It wasn't any problem with the culture. It was just my fault. I moved somewhere and didn't take enough money, ran out of money, and I couldn't eat for 3 days till I got a paycheck. But that was my fault. That had nothing to do with how God provides. We can't see God. We don't hear God. We think about Him. We have an awareness of Him. But because we don't see Him and hear Him, we don't look at God in that sense of dependence that this widow of Zarephath did. We don't. And because of that, we tend to rely upon the things we can see and that we can do and that we can have an effect upon. I think about it in terms of like Joshua, right? The same thing. Joshua, if you go back and read the account of Joshua, they come to Jericho. They do what God says, which some of it sounds kind of silly. Go march around Jericho several times and then blow the trumpets after the 7th trip and the walls will come down and you can go in and take the city. That doesn't sound like self-reliance. That sounds like something else. Well, they got done with that and they did it. Yay, we've conquered Jericho. Then they come to the next city, Ai, and they just wade right on in there and God lets them be defeated. What I love about that text is not the lesson of the defeat. What I love about the text is the lesson of what Joshua did right after that. He prayed, but he prayed an honest prayer. What are you doing, God? What the heck are you doing? I think that a lot of times God brings us to places where we're going to be so broken that all we can do is pray those honest prayers. The ones that say, what are you doing? Not the ones that talk about the hymn words or the pretty sunset or the nice flowers or how you've provided for me all my life and I'm so thankful. No, the prayers that say, God, what the heck are you doing? That's an honest prayer. And I think one of the limitations we have as human beings in our relationship to God is that we don't do that a lot because we don't think that He likes it very much. I'll tell you, we will never learn who God is until we become poor enough that He's the only place we can go. I'm not that poor. I'm not. I've got lots of support around me to rely upon. I'm not poor enough yet to really understand. We think about ourselves in terms like this Jewish crowd. Self-piety. In other words, let me come to church. Let me say church things. Let me say things and talk in ways that I think God likes to hear. But inside me, or inside us, there are things just boiling. And we won't say them because we're afraid that somehow it won't butter God up. Joshua didn't bother about any of that. He just cried out to God, what the heck are you doing? You look through Moses' life and you see the same thing. Look through David's life and you see the same thing. You see somebody who is willing to cry out to God in utter honesty. God, what are you doing? I don't understand. Jesus uses Naaman the Syrian. He steps on their toes via Naaman the Syrian, but Naaman did something very significant. What did Naaman do? Just think about the story for a minute. He shows up, comes to Elisha's house. Remember? And when a Middle Eastern person comes to a person's house, what do they expect? They expect the person to come out and greet them. Well, Naaman comes, he's got his attendants with him, got on all his medals and his shield and his armor and his helmet and his swords and everything. This is an important looking guy. He comes there and Elisha doesn't even come out of the house. He sends Gehazi out there and says, go dip in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be healed, and shuts the door. And Naaman is furious. He is furious. And his soldiers say to him, but Commander Naaman, if he'd have told you to go on some long, great, hard quest, you'd have done it to be healed. But he asks you to do something very simple and you won't go. Why? Because it hurts our pride to see ourselves having to do the stupid thing in order for God to do something in our lives. Why is that? Because we don't have anything then to do with it. All we come is with those empty, like a little kid, who's been playing in the dirt, empty little hands, and we come up and we say, Dad, please. God responds to that. There's an honesty there. There's an honesty. Romans chapter 8 says that our hearts are naturally hostile to God. That's what the text says. And I think this reaction to Jesus in this moment is exactly the reaction that tells us that that is true. And our reaction a lot of times is the same. We're not willing. I was talking about this with some friends of mine yesterday. I am convinced, totally convinced, until somebody can demonstrate to me otherwise, that we cannot make ourselves humble. I don't think we can do it. But I guarantee you God can. He can bring us to a place where we find ourselves utterly dependent on God, and no place else can we depend. That widow in Zarephath was like that, and God blessed it. I'm going to say this week, I got my first glimpse of just how poor I am not. I got my first glimpse of just how poor I am not when I was confronted with something this week for which I had no answers, couldn't think it through, couldn't figure it out, couldn't respond to it properly, could not even think about it in terms of what's the right thing here. It was something so real in my life that the only thing I could say was, God, please help me here. That was a glimpse. It lasted just a few hours. I'm still not poor enough yet. We cannot learn humility except by obedience. That's what Naaman did. He obeyed. He said to himself, why do I want to go to that muddy old Jordan when the Parfar in Damascus is a far nicer river, kind of like the difference between the Satilla and the Tekoa. Tekoa's got that clear water where you can see right to the bottom. Who wouldn't want to dip in that? But then you go down to Satilla and you can't see 6 inches deep. Who would want to dip in that? There's a sense in which Naaman was willing to say, I'm willing to do something totally stupid to me because it was asked of me. I'm willing to allow myself to be broken and humbled in order that God would bless me. And he came up out of the Jordan healed. Are we willing to desire God's best for us sufficiently that we're willing to allow God to break us so we can have it? I don't know the answer to that for everybody. I don't even know that I know it for myself. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, speak to me about this church, I'll stay as long